Hey, I hope everyone is doing great, that you had a wonderful Easter, even though it was a little bit different, and that you're doing well in quarantine. I'm really excited to share with you my own thoughts about Les Mis, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. So we all watched the Les Mis 2012 movie, which is based on the novel by Victor Hugo, which was written in 1862, and it was known as one of the greatest novels of the 19th century. Once you have experienced the story, it's not hard to know why. Victor Hugo, from my own research, was not a Christian, or at least that's what he did not identify himself in that way. He seemed to have issues with the Roman Catholic Church, which led him to not identify himself as a Christian, but he did have a belief in God, which can be evidenced in his works. And so we see these pieces of theology and his other central themes of redemption, equality, justice, and love that have been highlighted in both the musical versions and the movie version of his work to show us some of his core understandings. So the story begins in 1815, and the first image that we see is that of the French flag that has been broken off of a ship. It's laying in the water, and it's battered and beaten, and I thought that that was a really neat artistic foreshadowing of the pain of the people of France that we are going to see throughout this story, and just the idea of suffering that is very present in our story. We're also introduced during this time to one of the other major themes of Les Mis, which is this idea of law and grace. And we see that pictured really well in the characters of Jean Valjean representing grace and Javert representing law most often. And we see this really set the tone right from the very first dialogue that we have, where Javert is talking to Jean Valjean, telling him that his parole is up after his 19 years of imprisonment, and Jean Valjean makes a comment that he is free, which Javert immediately denies, which is a precursor of what is to come, this denial of freedom that we see throughout the rest of the story in the way that Javert interacts. Valjean then explains his situation of why he was imprisoned, and he says that we were close to starving, to which Javert replies, "You'll starve again unless you learn the meaning of the law," to which Valjean says, "A meaning to those 19 years, a slave of the law." Here we are further introduced to this main theme of Javert and his relationship to the law. For Javert, the law is the utmost authority. It is what has the greatest jurisdiction, and it must be obeyed. If not, then you must pay the consequences. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. This is the way that it is. Very black and white. This is the way that it is. For Javert, for Jean Valjean, he talks about his own experience of being a slave to the law during his time of imprisonment, which I thought had a really cool theological connection possibly to our own experience with the law. How in our sin, and in the previous experience, we are slaves to the law, whereas once we are freed by grace in Jesus Christ, we are now servants of God, like in Romans 7:6, where it says, "But now we have been released from the law, for we died to it, and are no longer captives to its power. Now we can serve God, not in the old way of obeying the letter of the law, but in the new way of living in the Spirit." I believe that throughout the rest of the story, we can start to see this wrestling and this tension between being slaves to the law and living in the Spirit. And that's going to be a theme that is very persistent throughout the rest of the story. Another idea that we are introduced right here at the beginning is this idea of oppression that we see. We see Javert referring to Valjean as 24601, and it is this calling of a number rather than a name that introduces us to the dehumanization that we see throughout the story as a major social issue. Once Valjean receives his papers, we see him walking up a hill, at which time he proclaims his freedom, and I thought it was interesting there that you see him doing so with the image of the cross behind him. During this time, he gives the caveat that he won't forgive those who oppressed him, but later on we'll see the same imagery again without that caveat. The next major idea that we see is in the way that the priest interacts with Jean Valjean in this idea of mercy. After Jean Valjean has struggled to find work, and because of his parole papers that are connected to his past, he is not being able to do anything. He's starving, and so the priest invites him in, gives him a place to stay and food to eat, and he refers to Valjean as an honored guest. In the book by Victor Hugo, I understand that there has been given a greater depth of explanation of the priest, both his backstory and his own personality and belief. One of those ideas is the idea that he did not study God, but he was dazzled by him. And I thought that that quote was really impactful in the idea of who the priest was. And though it's not mentioned in the movie, the fruit of that type of lifestyle is very evidenced in the way that we see the priest portrayed in the movie. We then see the way that Valjean responds to the grace that he's being given with the disrespect as he steals from the priest. He's brought back by the soldiers who ask if the priest has given Valjean the silver that he has taken. We see the priest respond in much mercy and grace, and one line that I believe is unforgettable from the story is when the priest says, "That's right, but friend, you left so early, surely something slipped your mind. You forgot I gave these also. Would you leave the best behind?" Not only does he not condemn Valjean, but he gives him an even greater gift. And I feel like that can be connected to our own experience with God, in that not only are we not condemned by God, he gives us opportunity to not be condemned by him, but he also gives us opportunity to experience his grace and his gifts in greater abundance than what we could ever imagine. The priest tells Valjean that he's giving him the silver to become an honest man, and this idea of the priest setting apart Valjean's soul for God is one that seems to fuel his actions throughout the rest of the story. We then see Valjean trying to mentally understand the grace that he's been given, this mercy, and he wrestles with this idea and that of the sin of his past, which ultimately leads him to decide that he's going to use this freedom and he's going to start his new life. You see him walk out of the area where he was kneeling before the cross out to this area with other crosses, and there you see him rip up his parole papers, throw them in the air, and declare his freedom. And I thought it was interesting there to see the imagery of the crosses all around him again as he's declaring his freedom. We're then taken to 1823, where Valjean is now the mayor, and we see him interacting with Javert again, and Javert yet again mentions that nobody is outside of the law, so even after all this time, we still see him representing the law in this way. We also see Fantine, who has been faced with great pain, and she is now having to figure out how to provide for her daughter. And I thought that the imagery when she was at the docks was really interesting, that you see her walking down the stairs to the docks where she sells her daughter's hair. She goes to leave, and she's being blocked by other people, and she's convinced to sell her hair, and you see her walk down a few more steps to go sell her hair, and then to sell her teeth, and you see her walking further down to the dock. And as she's going and being immersed in greater and greater pain and being surrounded by deeper and deeper evil, you see her walking down and down and down into the dock. And so I thought that was interesting, this picture that you have here of her moving down to when she eventually becomes a prostitute. And she says, "Don't they know that they're making love to one that's already dead?" And you see this walking into this pain and this evilness that ultimately leads her to feeling dead. We then see Valjean down at the docks, and he's giving to the poor, and that's when we see this law grace idea yet again, and the way that they interact with Fantine when she is being arrested for defending herself. Whereas Javert, representing the law, tells her to save her breath, save her tears, honest work, just reward, that's the way that pleases the Lord. Whereas Valjean tells Javert that she needs a doctor and not a jail. And so we'd see these different interactions with her based on these central ideas of law and grace. Valjean wrestles with the idea that there has been a man that has come forward, or there has been a man that has been arrested who they believe is Valjean, even though it's not. And when Javert finds this out, he comes and apologizes to Valjean and says that he does not deserve forgiveness. So it's interesting to see that this character that represents the law is just as hard on himself as he is on other people. Valjean ultimately decides that if he speaks, then he's condemned, but if he stays silent, then he is damned. And so it's interesting seeing this man who went from stealing the silver from the priest to ultimately acknowledging that he acknowledges his identity and faces the consequences. The next interaction that we see between Valjean and Javert is at the hospital when they're having that scene where they are fighting, and that's when we learn Javert's past, that he was born in a prison, he lived in poverty, just like Jean Valjean. But the difference is that Javert, he worked hard and was able to earn a position of honor, whereas Jean Valjean was bestowed his position of honor by the priest in his mercy. In the book, it talks about how he used the silver to be able to buy the supplies that he needed to start this new life. And so here we see a total act of mercy, whereas for Javert, his honor is developed by his works. And so these different experiences definitely affect the way that they view the world, and I would say the way that they view God. We then meet Cosette, and it's interesting here to see the different dynamics that we see with the innkeeper and his wife, who the wife refers to her as street scum. The innkeeper cannot remember her name to save his life. And this is in direct contrast with the love and honor that she receives from Valjean, who buys her freedom and says, "Where I go, you will be. I'll be father and mother to you." We see Valjean and Cosette running from Javert, and the scene in this part of the play ends with this ballad from Javert where he's singing about how Valjean is a fugitive that's fallen from God and fallen from grace, which makes me wonder what exactly his definition of grace might be, if he doesn't believe that Valjean is deserving of grace. He also states here that he believes that his way is the way of God, that he believes that he's serving the Lord and tracking down Valjean. And so we take a swap here into 1832, so about 9 years later, and we kind of change gears here to where before we had this emphasis on law and grace. And while we'll still see it a little bit here, we're now focusing on more the social dynamic. And so when we are brought into this time period, it starts with the song Look Down, which we heard at the beginning of the movie, there with the prisoners who are in chains. Here we're seeing people who are not in physical chains, but we are seeing the people who are still oppressed. We're seeing the poor as they're crying out for justice and equality. We are now going further immersed into these social themes of the story of justice and equality. During the commotion that starts on the street with Jean Valjean, Javert refers to the poor as vermin and maggots, and I felt like this really emphasized part of the problem here of this dehumanization, this lack of honor and respect that is what is being fought for by the rebels. During this part of the story, we also see the theme of sacrifices being made. We see Marius sacrificing his own family ties in order to fight with the rebels. We see Eponine sacrificing her love and her life with Marius. We see Valjean sacrificing his life with Cosette in order to secure her happiness with Marius. And we see the sacrifice of the lives at the barricade. Part of the lyrics of Do You Hear the People Sing? They sing, "The blood of the martyr will water the meadows of France." And we see this idea being portrayed in this part of the story. It is their sacrifice that is the hope for their future. I thought it was interesting that the first person to be shot by the soldiers was a woman, and then at the barricade, the first people to be shot were a woman and a child, which are typically going to be more associated with this idea of innocence, I would say. And so it's interesting to see that that's where we see this fighting beginning, and it helps us to understand the depravity that's happening here in France at this time, and helps us to understand the plight of the rebels here. It is once Javert that is caught by the spy that we are returned to the theme of grace and law. Valjean is given the opportunity to kill Javert and to be rid of his problem once and for all, but he chooses not to and allows Javert to escape, to which Javert tells tells Valjean, once a thief, always a thief. I know that you must have some kind of condition attached to this mercy. And Valjean explains that there is no condition. In fact, he does not even blame Javert. He has done his duty and nothing more for all that has happened between the two of them in the past. He gives Javert the location that he can find him after this is all over. After the scene at the barricade, we see Javert again, and he is walking through the casualties, and he walks past his soldiers to the rebels, and he takes the pin off of his coat and pins it on the child, which starts to maybe make your heart think that there might be some redemption ahead for Javert, but it turns out to be a rather anticlimactic moment once you see what happens with Javert. So the next thing that we see is Valjean escaping from the sewer carrying Marius, and Javert is there waiting for him. He's given the opportunity to end the feud between them, but he can't do it because of the mercy that Valjean has given to him, and he throws his gun into the sewer. His own failure to enforce the law which he lives for is too much for him to handle. We see him sing this song where he's trying to reconcile the idea of that Valjean could have killed him, but decided not to. And he says, in granting me my life today, the man has killed me even so. He couldn't handle the fact that he now lives in debt to Valjean for his life. He decides that he must escape the world of Jean Valjean, and he kills himself. Javert's whole system of understanding the world would have had to be completely rearranged in order to work with this idea of mercy, and we see here that he has an inability to do so. I wonder if part of that would be that because of the way that we heard about his past and the works that he has done to bring him to the position of honor, to earn his righteousnness, that because those would be worthless in the face of mercy, he believes that there's no point in living in a world that sees grace in this way. And so here we see an end to the law and grace tension that we've seen throughout the story, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The final scene is definitely a tearjerker as Valjean is sitting in the convent. He's singing a prayer to God to take him now to be with him. We see Fantine with him, who tells him that he has raised her child with love and will be with God because of his faithful service. He then gives Cosette his last confession. He says it's a story of one who turned from hating, a man who only learned to love when you were in his keeping. In this beautiful parallel to the opening scene, we see Valjean. When we see Valjean in chains, Fantine tells him, "Come home to where chains will never bind you." She says, "All your grief at last behind you." The final words of Valjean is a calling upon the grace of God, which I believe is so consistent with his character of grace. He says, "Forgive me for all my trespasses. Take me to your throne." After he dies, we see him greeted by the priest who initially showed him mercy, and we're given this idea. And remember the truth that once was spoken: to love another person is to see the face of God. The final triumphant image that we see is one of eschatological hope. We see all those who have died together on this barricade, and they're declaring these words: "We will live again in freedom in the garden of the Lord. The chain will be broken, and all men will have their reward." We are given the glimpse of a world beyond the barricade, and the joy that the ultimate tomorrow will bring. I absolutely enjoy Les Mis. I have loved the movie, and I think that there are a lot of strengths around this story. I think one of the strengths would be that it is very consistent to the book, in my understanding the way that Victor Hugo wrote the book and has his central themes. They are portrayed pretty consistently in the movie and in the play, which is really encouraging to see. There's also beautiful imagery that we see in the story. There is powerful acting and songs. The movie was very well produced, and so I think that only goes to strengthen the message and to make sure that our minds are focused on the central theme instead of being distracted by if the art was produced in a way that didn't add to the story. I think it offers both a theological and social conversation to take place. It gives us a space to do so, and it does so in exposing us to these ideas without cheapening them. We are given these ideas and we're shown great depth, and I think part of that has to do with the way that the characters are developed that allows us to really explore these ideas without giving a super cheap version of them. I think that there aren't necessarily a whole lot of weaknesses here, which some of you might disagree with. In my own personal opinion, I would say that one of the weaknesses might be the way that Javert's character is portrayed, in that he represents the law really well, which is excellent. It definitely helps us to see that dynamic of grace and law. However, he does so in such a rigid way that it's almost inhuman, I would say. It's kind of hard to, even if you have the same beliefs as him, even if you feel like his central plight is one that you agree with, the way that he goes about it sometimes, without ever relenting, what might make it a little bit harder for the average person to be able to relate with him. And so I think that there might be a disconnect there between the character and the audience's own life experience, though he does represent the law really well. Another weakness might be the tendency to see law and grace as completely incompatible in these stories. Here we see that in the end of the story, Law dies. This character that has portrayed the law doesn't feel like he can live in a world where there's grace, and so he must die. However, as believers, we understand that there is a purpose to the law. While sometimes the law can be used in ways that are not pleasing to God, there is a central purpose for why we have the law. And it finds its ultimate fulfillment in the grace of Jesus Christ. So the story leaves us with only a one-sided image of that, whereas our own theological understanding sees them as a little bit more interwoven together when we look at the idea of law and grace, and then further on in our Christian life, the idea of law and of grace and works. And so we see these ideas playing together really intricately, which I don't feel like they were played together at all in the story. They were seen as complete opposites. Overall, though, I believe that Les Mis invites the audience into the tension of law and grace really effectively. I think that it's this idea of law and grace that helps stimulate the other theological and moral ethical themes that we see here, including that of redemption, sacrifice, and love. It is through the lens of the theological themes that we're able to interact with the social themes of oppression. So if you take this idea of grace and allow that to feature idea of love, we look at the idea, like I mentioned earlier, about the end of the play ending with this idea that to love another person is to see the face of God. And we see the way that that interacts with how we go about the social issues that are portrayed here, how we're going to interact with oppression. It is only after we learn how to love through grace that we can uplift one another's humanity. It is only the correct theological understanding that we can fight the good fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. And so as we see the struggle between being a slave to the law and our life in the Spirit, it's going to be that idea that's going to portray the way that we see social issues and the way that we go about helping the oppressed and seeking out ways to show grace in our own experience of grace. And so I believe that Les Mis invites us into that conversation really well and can be used to stimulate those ideas in our own theological imagination, in our own conversations. I believe that it can be a great springboard, and it must be used in that way. So my two questions that I have for you, the first one has to do with the idea of law and grace being portrayed through Javert and Valjean, and the way that that interacts with their perspective of God. So question number one is, how would Javert's perception of God differ from that of Valjean? How do you see these perspectives of God in your own Christian experience? Are these two perspectives of God going to be completely incompatible? Are they interwoven together? And how do you see those in your own life? The second question would be about more of the social and theological dynamic that we see here. And so it is, what social and theological issues facing our church today do you believe to be related to the issues in Les Mis? So what kind of issues do you face in the church today, do you face in the world today, that you believe could have social or theological connections to that of the art that we see here in Les Mis? I hope this was helpful, and I look forward to seeing your discussion.